Welcome to our live webcast. You're in Courageous Leadership with Minda Harts. Thank you for joining us. My name is Leslie Haas, and I will be providing the features of the web event technology, managing the chat, and presenting the session facilitator. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acquaint you with a few of the features of this web event technology. At any time, you may adjust your audio using any computer volume settings that you may have. On the right hand of your screen, you'll see the Q&A chat window. There is a large window that holds all of your messages sent and a smaller text box at the top where you will type in your questions. To send a question, click the text box and type your text. When finished, click the Ask button. Your questions will be responded to at the end of the presentation as time permits. We are joined today by our session facilitator, Minda Harts, and I invite you to review her bio, which can be accessed on the DEI virtual event platform. She is the best-selling author of her book, The Memo, What Women of Color Need to Know to Secure a Seat at the Table. And I had the privilege of joining her and Dr. Nika White this summer for a book club around her book and was blown away. So I'm super excited for today's session, and think you will be too. So at this time, I'd like to turn the microphone over to our session presenter, Minda Harts.
Thank you so much, Leslie. So good to see you again. And thank you to all of you. I know that you could be anywhere right now and you're here with us, so we don't take that lightly, and hope you have something to hydrate. I got my cup here too. Awesome. So I guess we'll get started. I'm going to share my screen with you all. Great. I hope you can see that. So here we go. We don't have a lot of time together, but we're going to make sure that we all become more courageous leaders by the end of our session together. And I don't know about you, but I'm one of those people who kind of like to know what's on the agenda for the time together. I guess that might be my type A personality. I like to know what's coming down the pipeline. But we're going to talk about choosing courage. We're going to talk about courage versus caution, because we can be courageous leaders or we can be cautious leaders. We have a choice, right? Courageous conversations, because once you become more courageous, you also, it doesn't stop there. You might have to have some courageous conversations. So what does that look like as a leader? What does that look like as a manager? And in my opinion, we are all have the capacity to lead. You don't have to have a title to lead. So I hope that you will consider yourself courageous before we even start, because you're here at the session with me. so you're all here, have that opportunity to be courageous. And then courageous listening, right? Sometimes we have to learn to hear people out, right? You don't have to agree with everything that someone says, but what would it look like to, hear someone out? And so we're all going to become better listeners by the end of the session together. And then I am a faculty member at NYU Wagner, and so I can't end a workshop session without some practice versus theory. We're going to put your what you've learned today in action. And so I hope that you will be active with us in the chat, because even though we're not together physically, we're still here in this virtual space together, and I want it to be as interactive as possible. I think we're hearing feedback from another.
I think that might be Matthew. Matthew, if you could, I can't mute him. If you could mute yourself.
Okay. And so we're going to do practice versus theory. But before we jump in, I want to find out a little bit more about you. So what I'm going to do is have you open up a tab, or if you're on your cell phone or a tablet, I want you to go on your screen. You'll see where you need to go, menti.com, menti.com. And when you go, so if you open up another browser on your phone or your screen, it's going to ask you this first question. We're going to do some polling together. What is one word that describes your leadership style? So if you go and put menti.com in your browser, and then you put in the code that's up at the top, you'll be able to, this is anonymous, so you don't have to worry, your name's not gonna pop up, your cell phone number's not gonna pop up, so you can be as honest as you as you need to be. I think in order for us to get to solutions, we have to be honest with where we are right now. So what is one word that describes your leadership style? So if you go to the website minty.com and put in the code 2406389, you'll be able to see that on your screen. And then everybody watching right now will be able to see what's coming up on the screen there. So we see nurturing, yes. And so this great little word bubble cloud will start to pop up. And so I want to learn a little bit more about you. What kind of leader are you currently? So we see participant, you're participative, you're adaptable, strategic, transparent, service, it's going so fast, nurturing, you're a coach, you're flexible. So you can see what some of the other people that are in the session with you, what their leadership style is. So I love seeing the things coming up there. Mentor, yes, I love it. And so the next question I have for you is, when I say the word courage, what comes to mind for you? So there on your screen, if you follow along, you'll be able to type in what courage means to you. And I love this tool because it gives us an opportunity to see what's in everybody's head, right? So we see honest, strong, brave, being vulnerable, teacher. Yes, there's no right or wrong answer. This is all about how you feel. Again, when I say the word courage, what comes to mind for you? And you can see it's starting to scroll up there. Oops. So we'll go back a little bit. So honest, being vulnerable, voice, fear, strong, strength and voice. Yes. Doing hard things with grace, decisive, speaking up, inspirational. I love all those things. And you can see those, ability to lead, tough decisions. So we all have an understanding of what courage means, and that doing the right thing, not being right, honesty, all those things, being authentic, inspirational. Yes, all of those things. And so here I have a question for you too, and you're gonna have to be honest. What is your comfort level with having hard conversations at work? And I love these little pictures, because if you watch The Office, number one, option one is bring it on, bring on those hard conversations. Number two is, if I have to pick having one, okay, but it's not necessarily what I like doing. And then number three, you have Trudy from The Facts of Life. I might be dating myself a little bit there, but she's like, I don't know if this is what I want to do. And so what is your comfort level with having hard conversations at work? I know some of us may be conflict averse, like we don't want to have hard conversations if we can help it. Some of us are very good at it, right? And again, hopefully by the end of our time together, you'll feel a little bit better. So I love this. So about 30-ish% of you are like, bring it on. And then almost, not quite half, almost like in the middle of it. And then we have a few. But listen, it's being honest with where we are, right? But in order to be able to be a courageous leader, we have to do those things that are sometimes tough, right? Even though they might benefit someone else if we have these conversations. And those are some of the things that we're going to talk about today. So I have another question here for you. When was the last time you had to be courageous at work? And so there's only 3 choices here, but last week, it's been a while, and I never have. Again, there's no judgment here. We're all family and friends. So let me know, when was the last time that you had to be courageous at work? So we're seeing a little movement on the scales there. And what I hope happens is that we'll be more comfortable being courageous leaders as we learn a little bit more about what that looks like, right? And how people benefit when we lean into our courage. And so you can see there, some folks have been courageous recently. It's been a while. And then hopefully in this time period that we're in right now, that we all have the opportunity to flex our courage muscle. And obviously you all want to be more courageous. That's why you're here today. So thank you for your honesty. And our last question, What do you think prevents you from being a more courageous leader? I think, again, once we're honest with ourselves in terms of where we are in our leadership journey, we can better understand where we're headed, right? And there was a time in my career where I definitely wasn't very courageous. So I've learned to flex. I've learned to flex that muscle. So we see the amount of energy I have, confidence. I'm afraid of offending someone and afraid they won't like me afterwards. Fear. Yeah, we're seeing some themes here, right? Management bias. I think we have some themes here. Fear of failure, self-confidence, conflict avoidance, people's feelings. Yep. We're seeing fear. Fear is the thing, right? So I talked about in the agenda, courage versus caution. And part of that caution is the fear, right? We fear what comes after. Also, we all have something in common, right? The perception, the confidence, the fear. Pretty much everybody has said the same thing almost. And so you're in good company. We all, as leaders, we will always continue to flex our leadership muscle. And again, we all have that sphere of influence. And so I thank you for participating in that portion, because I feel like it's important for us to have a little self reflection and understand where we're going. And then because we aren't in the room together, typically I could see your heads bobbing, or if you grew up in church like me, I might hear an amen or something like that, but I don't get to see that right now. And so this is my way of being able to have you participate in the conversation as well. So this is great. So we'll go back to my trusty slideshow here. And so what you've seen is that all of us are at a different place in our leadership journey, right? We're all doing things a little bit differently, but at the crux of it, fear seems to sometimes hold us back, right? And the one thing that I want you, if you get nothing out of today with me, is understanding what courage is. Courage is the definition on your screen right now. The ability to do something that frightens one. And if you're taking notes, I hope that you will see that, because it's so important that you understand how you have the opportunity to be courageous. And so let's talk about it. I want to tell you a little bit about my journey. I want to talk to you about some of those things. You might be aware that there are 8 leadership styles. Transactional, and that looks like I give you this and you do that. Transformational, and those leaders tend to inspire others. Servant leadership is serve first, lead second. Democratic, they like to achieve consensus. Autocratic, those leaders like to have it their way or the highway. We have bureaucratic leaders. They like things by the book. Those laissez-faire, they like to think about it from the terms of, if it's not broke, don't fix it, right? And then you have charismatic leaders. They have that magnetic personality, and their team might even walk on hot coals for them. But I want to add a 9th today, and that is the courageous leadership. Imagine Sarah Breedlove Walker walking down her brownstone on West 139th Street in Harlem, maybe once cautious as she strategically plotted her way to creating her Madam C.J. Walker empire. Cautious leadership might have initially painted a picture of an American dream that did not include Black women as millionaires. Yet it was her courage that proved that our dreams matter too. Her courage we now see manifested in other African American companies. Another person, I live in New York City, that was in New York City around that time was Marcus Garvey, and he was on Lenox Avenue. Marcus Garvey Jr. so elegantly sat in his car in a Harlem parade in 1922. In the storm of a cautious America, sounds similar to what we're dealing with right now, right? In the storm of a cautious America, where Black men were considered 3/5 a person, he peered out into the crowd of like minds and faces with the audacity of hope and courage to lead one of the biggest mass movements in our history. And he inspired Black people around the world to take pride in their heritage. With a new narrative of economic and political power for Black folk living in Harlem, it could only take courage to see yourself redefined with dignity. Recently, we've seen many of our leaders shrink in the face of adversity. Many have turned their backs on injustice and remain cautious in the face of racism. Leadership is not a badge of honor one picks up at the local grocery store. Leadership is earned. And being an effective leader will require one to proceed with courage and push aside their caution. As I mentioned, Webster's dictionary defines courage as the ability to do something that frightens one. And for continuity's sake, the same dictionary defines caution as careful to avoid potential problems or danger. Courage allowed many African Americans to escape the racial terrors of the Jim Crow South and head north to New York City during the Great Migration. Caution is what prevented many of their counterparts from renting them apartments right in New York City because of the color of their skin. It takes courage to build a legacy, and it takes caution to prevent one. I never saw myself as a leader, not until I was faced with a problem. And just like Madam C.J. Walker and Marcus Garvey, we all have two options: to proceed with courage or lead with caution. The problem with leading from a place of caution is our decisions ultimately affect the future generations that are counting on us. They're counting on me and you to lean into our courage. Making courageous decisions should not be an act of selfishness, but selflessness, meaning leaders don't solve problems that only benefit their bottom line, but future generations. It's not easy to be courageous, but then again, not everyone is meant to lead. Leadership is a privilege, yet we attach this label to those who have not done anything courageous to earn their followers. Leaning into your courage takes vision and revolutionary acts. We can all point to a bad leader. Many of us have probably worked with or for some of them. Yet courageous leadership is not about placing the blame, it's about making a change. Cautious leaders use rhetoric, courageous leaders take action. The problem I was faced with is a problem that maybe some of you have had to experience, and that's being one of the only ones in the room. It takes time to flex our courage muscle, as I mentioned to you, and it's more complicated than a simple wash, rinse, and repeat process. But I would ask you today, during our time together, to consider 3 ways to incorporate courageous leadership practices so that success doesn't benefit one group of people, but it's inclusive for all. As I mentioned, when I was at my crossroads, I had to first identify what I planned on being courageous about. So that is the first part of courage, right? You have to identify what you plan on being courageous about. Because when you are the only Black woman in the workplace, you learn to be cautious at the expense of your own well-being, due to rubber strap tropes that greet us our first days on the job. You know the ones: the angry Black woman, or just work harder, wait your turn. You learn to be cautious, not to speak up when the company brags that diversity matters, yet no one in leadership looks like you. You settle into caution because microaggressions and bias have gotten the best of you. But as many of our elders would say, when you get sick and tired, you'll make a change. And I got sick and tired. I don't know about you, but the times that you've had to be courageous, was it because you were just tired of the status quo? My courageous leadership showed up, and I decided I could no longer survive in the workplace. I wanted to thrive. That would mean speaking up for Black and brown women in the workplace. I identified a problem I was experiencing, and I no longer wanted to adjust to the status quo because I knew others were coming behind me that deserved equity, not just gender equality, but racial equity. That courage that I spoke of led me to create my company to help women of color prepare for their seat at the table. And after I was able to identify the problem, I couldn't stop there. It would require another act: intent. My intent was not to get my seat at the table and kick up my feet. I had to secure my seat and make sure that women who looked like me knew that there was a table waiting for them and they had options. So let's pause for a second. We're understanding how courage, what it looks like, right? We have to identify what are those things that we're going to be courageous about in the workplace. What are we going to do as a manager to be courageous, right? And then what is our intent? It shouldn't just benefit our bottom line, but it should benefit others, right? And that's being courageous, right? It's easy to be selfish. It's easy to be a leader that only thinks about ourselves. But what if we make the workplace better than we found it? We all get to benefit from that, right? I needed other women of color to know that they don't have to be cautious any longer. I started my company in 2015, but I couldn't stop there. Courageous leadership required a third act, and that was to accelerate. And let me tell you something, when you start leaning into being a more courageous leader, you won't be able to stop. You're going to always see that there's more opportunities awaiting you to be courageous and not cautious. There will always be opportunities to be cautious, right? But you'll see that there'll be more opportunities to be courageous, right? It takes some work to be courageous. And again, it takes that flexing muscle of doing that. And so after we've identified how we want to be courageous, figuring out our intent, then we got to accelerate because we've waited so long, right? When I think about my work, I waited so long to be courageous that I had to accelerate. I had to make up for some lost times, right? Statistics say that less than 5% of women of color are in the C-suite, and that record numbers of Black women are leaving corporate America due to the lack of opportunity, due to the fact that many of our current leaders are not invested in our success. I realized that I could not wait. Courageous leadership required me to act even faster. I needed to reach more women and tell them they don't have to defer their dreams of the C-suite due to cautious leaders that won't retain and advance them. I had to speak louder so that our voices were no longer inaudible. And as Dr. King wrote in his letter from the Birmingham jail, we will live in the monologue and not the dialogue. In the acceleration phase of courageous leadership, I decided to write my first book, The Memo, about the experiences of women of color in the workplace. We often don't get to read about our experiences. Despite the fact that I did feel cautious when I did every single one of those steps, my curiosity to tap into my courage was larger than my fear. Let me say that again. My curiosity to tap into my courage was larger than my fear. Will you allow your curiosity to be larger than your fear? The curiosity to see what's on the other side of that fear, which is courage. Courageous leadership, again, just so you remember, it's identifying the problem, mobilizing your intent into action, and accelerating the process for those who have been left out. A different mode of leadership is required, and I believe courageous leadership is what we need right now and in the future. As leaders and managers, we must learn to thrive in a new reality. Difficult times will come, but we still have to lead. If you haven't been courageous now, if you haven't been courageous in the past, now is a really good time to start. Very good time to start. You can always start being courageous because when the worst happens, we have to put people first. And when we think about those things, if we aren't courageous, then nobody benefits. Now that we have an understanding of courageous leadership, let's talk about courageous listening, because I think that is part of it. I hope you can understand where we are in terms of our courageous leadership. And I want to hear from you. What are you thinking about that? You've heard my story, and we're going to dig in a little bit deeper. Are you ready to go even deeper into courageous leadership? Or have I scared you away? Are you cautious? What's going on?
And Minda, we've had a couple of people ask if the presentation should be advancing.
Oh, is the presentation not advancing?
We still see the ability to do something that frightens one.
Okay, let's see. Do you see it now?
I do not. If someone wants to hop in the comment box and let us know if you see anything different. It looks like we still see your screen, but it might just be frozen.
Yeah, it looks like it's frozen. Let me stop share.
Okay.
And then try to share again and see what we find. But how's any questions coming up in the chat?
Let's see, we have had a great question. Please help us understand your view of the difference between emotional driven courage versus principle centered courage.
Oh, that's a great question. Emotionally, yeah, it's interesting. I'm trying to, that's a great question, and we're definitely going to get to that. I don't know. These are the things that, so are you seeing my screen? Are you seeing the slides at all?
I'm not seeing your screen at the moment.
Okay, let's try here. Okay. So it says I'm sharing my screen, but are you
got a notification that says you've started sharing your screen, but it just hasn't popped up yet.
That's so interesting. I apologize. I don't know. Are you
And,
seeing
and,
it?
and that's okay, because everything that you're saying is wonderful, and I'm taking notes as well, and I'm sure everyone else is taking notes too. So we are still absorbing all of your nuggets of knowledge.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, your screen is back up, but it still says the ability to do something that frightens one.
Okay. So I don't know what happened. I pulled another slide deck that it doesn't have everything that we wanted to do, because I don't know what's causing the problems with my other one, but it seems like it's stuck. So you all understand what courage is, the ability to do something that frightens one. Now let's
There
talk
we
about,
go. Now it's moving. There we go.
okay. So let's talk about courageous listening, because one of the things that, thank you, Leslie, for that. One of the things that I have found when we have to be courageous, and just like I asked you all earlier, what is prohibiting you from maybe being courageous, right? Or having those conversations. And we thought about, what will others think? Am I going to make a mistake? Am I going to rub somebody the wrong way? And the main thing about being courageous is, first, especially as a manager, we have to learn to listen. We have to learn to educate, and then we have to activate. I think for so long, as many leaders, we sit in our, ivory towers, and we make decisions for people, but we haven't asked them what they really need to be successful, right? When I was writing the memo, I interviewed over 100 women of color, and I asked them, how many of you feel like your managers are invested in your success? And over 70% of them said that they felt like their managers were not invested in their success. But I bet if we were to ask their managers, they would say something differently, right? So two things can be true at the same time, but I think part of it is we're not having the kinds of conversations. I mentioned earlier to you about hearing people out, right? Asking people for what they need. And courageous leadership is we have to learn to ask the right questions. And sometimes we're not asking the right questions because we're afraid of what the answers might be, right? But part of that, getting those answers, is part of making us a better leader. So how do we listen with courage, right? So I can be courageous, and someone, even think about it. If I come to you as a manager and I have something that I want to tell you that took place in a meeting that made me feel othered in a meeting, that manager or leader or colleague has to be a courageous listener, right? You can't dismiss what someone is experiencing or what they're saying. Now, again, you may or may not agree with what they're saying, but we have to listen with courage, and we have to educate. We have to ask the right questions. Why does this person feel this way? What is happening? What's in the environment, right? And we have to activate what we heard. We can't just pretend that these things aren't happening, or that people on our team aren't feeling this way. And so when you think about what being a courageous leader is, it's listening first, it's educating ourselves. What are the resources? What are the tools that you need to better understand the experiences of maybe someone who doesn't look like you, right? Or, many of us in management positions, we sometimes forget what it's like to be on the other side. So put yourself back in that space. How would you want someone to hear you out? How would you like someone to listen to you, educate themselves on the issues and the matter, and activate what you've been told, right? And I think that's so important. Now, this is the fun part. I mentioned to you that we're going to do some practice versus theory, and this is an opportunity for you to be courageous. So let's talk about it. I'm giving you a scenario here that we're going to break down and talk about, and I hope you'll give some answers in the chat. But here's the scenario. I'll read it out to you. You're a manager at a large company, and you've been asked to help your colleague interview for open roles on his team. You've interviewed 8 candidates. 3 are women of color. You've noticed that your colleague doesn't make eye contact with the women of color like he does with white male candidates. He interrupts them as they're answering questions and quickly moves on to the next topic before they can finish speaking. With white male candidates, he appears engaged and participates in conversation, but with female candidates, he seems disinterested and bored. You find his behavior demeaning and dismissive. You're also not sure if he's aware that it's a problem. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm sure we've been in similar situations like this, maybe not particularly in a hiring situation, but we've observed something taking place on our team, right? And we know that something is off about it. And this is an opportunity, right? This hiring manager, let's call him Steve. Steve has an opportunity to be courageous, right? Or he can continue to be cautious. And you can see even in the end of the scenario, Steve finds Mark's behavior demeaning and dismissive, but Steve also isn't sure if he's even aware. And so I want to open up the chat and kind of dissect this. Where is the opportunity to be courageous in this scenario? And sometimes we actually need to see what courage looks like so that when it's happening, so you could actually be in a conference call, on a Zoom call, on a Google Hangout, and someone is dismissed or they never get a chance to say a word, right? They might be the only person on the team. They might be a woman of color. They might be the only mother. They might be the only veteran, right? And we're seeing a different type of experience that they're having. And we know when someone else is being mistreated. So it's interesting to me that this is an opportunity for the manager to be courageous, right? Because let me tell you this, nobody benefits when we're cautious. And if the manager continues to be cautious in this environment, then you know what? Those 3 women of color who interviewed, this might have been a really great role for them. But nobody's advocating on their behalf. Nobody is saying, you know what? This person may be interviewing with bias, right? It's very clear that they are, and so this person should probably not be hiring in this way. Like, somebody should know about this. But if we don't lean into our courage, and I know this is kind of an extreme case, is going 0 to 100 really fast, but sometimes in the workplace, that's what is required of us, that courageous leadership. Leslie, would it be okay to see what are some people saying about the scenario in the chat?
Yeah, absolutely. We haven't had a lot of feedback in the chat yet, but if you guys would like to get active, your questions are definitely coming in. So send us some questions on over.
Yeah. So while you're thinking about it, my question to you is, where we're saying, where does he have the opportunity to be courageous? And so if I were to give some advice, if I were a coach in this situation, what I would say, there's plenty of opportunities to be courageous right here. And one thing that could happen is, I forget who I said his name was, Steve, Steve, the hiring manager, the manager, he could go to his colleague and say, hey, and I don't think we shouldn't even have made it through 8 candidates, right? With this happening, that's the first stop. When the manager noticed that this type of bias was taking place, the most courageous thing that he could have done at that moment was pause on maybe 2 interviews after he might have seen it happening, and then say, you know what, let's take a pause. Let's not have any more interviews for a minute. Let me talk to you out in the hallway, or let me talk to you, in a breakout room. I know we're in virtual environment, so it's a little bit different. And have the conversation. Hey, I noticed that you were doing this when you were interviewing women of color. I don't know if you were aware of it, but I just wanted to make you aware of it because I'm sure they are aware of how they're feeling in this environment. Right.
Yeah, and that's exactly what Lanika says. She says, very disrespectful. Those women do not have a choice. We have to call this behavior to the table, have a conversation, and provide education. Seems like maybe confirmation bias and possibly implicit.
Yeah, there's a lot. Thank you for that. There's a lot of bias taking place, right? But what if that manager, and this is my point, so many of us are allowing our caution, our fear, not to even say anything when we see inequalities happening and nobody benefits. What if this was an opportunity for one of those women to finally have an opportunity to have a seat at the table? But because this bias is taking place, who's going to advocate on their behalf? And when I mentioned earlier in my talk about my story, is the importance of being courageous. Who are you going to be courageous for, right? Because again, nobody benefits when we're cautious. If you think about those who have come before us, the Martin Luther Kings, I mentioned Madam C.J. Walker earlier, like people like them, even down to, I don't know if you're an Apple fan, I might have Android users out there, but even Steve Jobs, right? Like courage, it takes courage to help someone else's legacy, right? In my opinion, if I would have not written the memo, it wouldn't have helped so many other women and just managers and people, humans, understand the experiences of some of women of color in the workplace. And I was nervous even writing that book, but who would have benefited if I didn't put that book out? And so think about yourself, even in this situation. Yes, this is hard, right? So one way he could have handled it was going to the colleague, pausing, saying, hey, I want to make this, bring this to your attention. But then the other part of it is even them going to the HR department, right? And saying, hey, I think that we may need to bring three women of color back in for an interview and interview in a different way. But to be honest, if this is going to be, if the other person interviewing them and acting this way is interviewing them for a role and they're acting this way, they're showing that they don't want these women of color on their team. And being courageous is understanding that, is that the type of manager that we want? Those who don't see value in everyone. So you see that there's a breakdown in the system in many aspects of this scenario. And this happens, it's very egregious in the workplace. Again, it may not be this blatant, but it can be subtle, right? And so when you think about it, even on a Zoom call, when somebody says something that's, they may not mean any harm when they said it, but it does mean harm to somebody else, right? We have an opportunity to be courageous, and you don't have to make people feel bad about it, but how would you feel if you were those three women of color that were coming in for this interview and feeling that on the other side? And if his colleagues saw it, then I'm sure they felt it too. Is there anything else, Leslie, that people might be putting in the chat that I didn't mention?
Yes. We have a question from Jalitha. She says, what if your attempt to advocate or discuss is met with anger or passive aggressiveness?
Yes, that's a great question. And you know what? Those things are going to happen, right? Because nobody, let's be honest, nobody wants to be told that they're exhibiting racist behavior, right? We see it in our country right now. No matter what people are doing, nobody wants to be called that, right? Even if the behavior might point that way. And the thing of it is we've made note of it. We've addressed it. And so if nothing else, maybe that person will think about what was said. They'll learn to be a courageous listener, right? But the part of the equation that we can solve is what we do. We get to determine, we have the choice if we want to be courageous. Now, how that other person accepts the information, that's not our concern, right? We can't be concerned. I think for so long, we are so concerned about how the other person is handling it. What will they think? And they might be friends, right? So you're put in a precarious situation because these two may be friends. But if you see this happening, how do we make the workplace better if we keep perpetuating systems of oppression, right? And that's what courageous leadership is. That's calling out some of these things, even when it's hard, right? You think about allyship in the workplace. This is a great form of active allyship, showing up for somebody. And we don't have to show up for people we know, but we show up for the system. Because what if three more women of color come, or men of color, or somebody that they just don't feel like they vibe with? And so that's going to always be a problem. But what if we have the opportunity to call it out right now? And maybe this has been happening for 10 plus years and nobody has had the courage to call it out. So like I said before, when we don't lean into our courage, we're cautious, and nobody benefits when we're cautious. And so many people could potentially benefit in this situation. So I think at the end of the day, if you know that you have to lean into your courage, think about the people who are coming behind you. Think about how you would want someone to show up for you in the workplace. You would want someone to be courageous for you. Okay. And I mentioned this to you, nobody benefits when you're cautious. And so I want you to think about those things, when they happen. And again, they might not be as big as that, but things happen. And I'm sure that you can think about those times in the last 90 days, in the last 60 days, in the last 30 days, when you could be courageous for someone. But ultimately, if you're courageous for somebody else, you're being courageous for you, right? So you benefit from the courage. The other part of the question I really want you to marinate on is, who will you be courageous for? If you're managing a team, think about what equity looks like for everybody. Think about the next time that you're in a room where you are the dominant majority in that room and another opportunity comes about, that you don't just put another person that looks and thinks and acts like you and the rest of the table. Maybe you're the one that leans into their courage and says, hey, have you considered someone like Minda for this role, right? These are the opportunities every day in the workplace that we get to be courageous. And not just for ourselves, but for others. And so the next time that you're met with a situation, ask yourself, who am I being courageous for, right? Because the other part of caution is, I hate to say the word, you all might log off right after I say it, but it's exhibiting cowardice behavior, right? And I know that none of you want that, right? And again, we have to eliminate that fear. Let your curiosity for courage, be better, be larger than that fear. And when I did the polling at the beginning, we had so many people that were feeling that anxiety, right? But if we want to make the workplace better than we found it, it's going to require us to do something different. And doing something different means sometimes being uncomfortable, but it's a muscle. I had mentioned it before, that small acts of courage. So think about it. Who will you be courageous for? Those small acts of courage will lead you to larger acts of courage. But we all have the ability. We all have two choices. We can lean into our courage, or we can lean into our caution. And I hope that the next time you're presented with being the opportunity to be a courageous leader, that you will do so. And my information is on the screen. I apologize that we had some technical difficulties along the way, but I hope that you are thinking about your leadership. You're thinking about your leadership style. As I said, you don't have to have the title to be a leader, right? And in another session, I'm sure we talk about how you gain that buy-in, how you have more of those hard conversations. But as we go into the next 2 weeks in our workplaces and in our country, think about what courageous leadership looks like. Think about what it means to be a courageous listener, right? Listen with courage, hear people out. And at the end of the day, we don't point fingers. Courageous leaders don't place blame. We're here to make a change. And so I'm looking forward to having a further conversation with Leslie. Thank you all.
That was wonderful, and I could listen to you talk all day, Minda. You are definitely a shining example of a courageous leader to all of us, and I'm thankful for you, the things that I've learned from you, and for your book as well. So anyone that's listening, I highly suggest that you check out Minda's book, The Memo, and then she also has a weekly podcast as well on taking a seat at the table. So we do have a couple of questions, and guys, please feel free to keep the questions rolling in, and be sure to ask them in the Q&A section and not just the chat session. So Minda, one question for you. What do you do if you are on a Zoom call and you attempt to stand up and you're immediately dismissed and met with unnecessary sarcasm?
Yes, that is a thing. And I'm sorry that you've experienced that. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier is what we can control, right? So we can't control what others do, but we can control what we do. And I think the more that we lean into that courage, then that sends a signal. It sets boundaries for what people know that you will tolerate, and not tolerate. And so what I would say is, we all have different leadership styles and we have ways of calling things out. And so maybe, thinking about the buy-in of others, using your chat box. Like I don't know about you, Leslie, but on these Zoom lives and Google Hangout lives and all the lives, I use my chat box. If there's something that's happening on the screen, and I know that if I say something to this particular person, I'm going to be met with opposition, I will send them a direct message, right? Hey, just want to let you know about this, right? And that diffuses it, right? Everyone doesn't have to know that don't like this situation that's happened. And I mentioned small acts of courage. And so I would say, think about the people that you're approaching too, and who are those people that you're building networks with, so that maybe it's not just you, but as people see that you're being courageous and you're calling things out in whatever mode makes sense to you, that other people will see, oh, if Minda's doing it, then I can do it too, right? Because our courage isn't just tied to us. It allows others to say, oh, that's what courage looks like. And now the next time that I see inequalities happening in the Zoom room, I can say it too, right? And so the one thing I would say is, the part of being courageous that I hope that you'll do is keep this empire state of mind over an enemy state of mind. Once you've said what you've had to say, try not to then center the person who's causing the harm, because I think that's where we go down the rabbit hole, right? We question ourselves, well, maybe what are they going to say? What are they going to do? You've done your part. And if they want to have a further conversation offline, welcome that, but I think that you can, again, diffuse the situation, but, you've said what you've said in a very diplomatic and professional way. And those people, we know those characters are always going to meet us with those things, right? And so when they do meet us with that opposition, that we just move on with our day, because that's who that person is. But you're standing up for equity, you're standing up for good, and somebody is benefiting when you do that. And so I just want to commend you, because it's not easy being courageous. That's why people don't do it as often.
Yeah, absolutely. And another question. So as someone who is a white person working to be an ally, before standing up for someone else, should we check with that person and say, hey, do you want me to take a stand for you, or should we just go ahead and do it?
I think that's a great, great question. And I think you can handle it in two ways, right? If you see something, let me give an example. So let's say that you're in a meeting and Brenda, she says, actually, I have some, and she's a woman of color. Let's say Brenda, she's the only woman of color on her team. She says, I was doing some research on one of our agenda items and I wanted to share it with everybody. And then one of her colleagues, who happens to be white, says, what do you know? You don't even have a college degree. Now the rest, this has happened. This is actually, I've changed the names, but this is something that someone's approached me with. And so when that situation happens, right, do you feel like you need to ask if that person wants you to stand up for them or not? Or do you feel like that it's your duty to do something in the moment? So two things I want to say about that, because I think sometimes we wonder, well, should I say anything? Should I not say anything? And what you can do, again, if you're not comfortable saying it out loud, you can then approach that person after the meeting and say, you know what, I noticed that you said this to Brenda. I just want to let you know that that was inappropriate, and I hope that you would consider apologizing to her, because that's not the type of work culture we want, that we'll tolerate here. And I think, again, when we normalize bad behavior, and those people like that say those things, that meant that they were saying other things like that, right? This probably wasn't the first time that person has said something egregious like that, right? And it's not the first time people just sat there and let her do it. So what are you going to do? We need to normalize better behavior in the workplace. And so it's okay. What would you want someone to do for you? That's the one thing I think about active allyship. Do what you'd want someone to do for you. And then you can go to Brenda after too and say, hey, Brenda, you know what? I apologize that Susie said that to you. I just want you to know that I had a conversation with her. And if that happens again, know that you're not alone in this, right? And the other thing I want to say, being a courageous manager is not allowing that type of toxicity to impede upon your team, right? So as a manager, you also have to be courageous and have a conversation with both parties, Brenda, to say, hey, this is not okay. And in that situation, the manager should be the one to diffuse the situation. That's what they're getting paid the big bucks for, right? So they should be the one to say, this is not okay, and set the tone, because courageous leadership sets a tone. And once we set a tone on our team, we will let those offenders know that this is not okay. And I promise you, they'll start to fade out and stop that behavior, but continue to be an active ally, right? And then afterwards, you can go to Brenda. Brenda is our fictitious person now, and ask, I know that happened. Here's how I handled it behind the scenes. But when that happens, what would you like me to do? Because I want you to know that you don't have to be there alone. And that's an opportunity for you to create relationship with your colleague as well.
That's a great idea. And we do have 3 questions, and something you just said leads into one of the questions really well. What if those small acts of courage leads to other issues like verbal warnings, or even worse, a write-up from your supervisor?
So I want to understand that a little bit more. Is that the person who's being courageous gets written up, or?
That's what it sounds like to me. What if those small acts of courage lead to other issues like verbal warnings, or even worse, a write-up from your supervisor? So I think that's
okay,
where that question's going.
Yeah, I'm not saying get fired from your job, right? Like, that's not what I'm advocating here. But what I'm advocating is for equity in the workplace, right? So understanding what are the things that are bothering you after they happen, right? What is something that you have to do something because this isn't right? So think about what that looks like, right? If you don't mind getting written up, or you don't mind losing your job because you believe that this is my activism, this is what I'm going to do, you can only make that choice. But what I will say is, when you think about who does this benefit, make sure that when you're doing it with strategy as well, right? So being courageous isn't necessarily calling somebody out on their bias or their microaggressions. Being courageous is making the workplace better than we found it. So when I told you identify what you want to be courageous about and what is your intent, make sure that your intent is going to be beneficial to you and to others, right? And so think about that, and also hopefully you'd have other people that you can rely on that also want a better workplace, right? But I think that be careful, because again, being courageous, it's not like leading a revolution of everybody walking out of the place. It's how do we create better culture, right? And so, but I'm rooting for you.
Awesome. Okay, another question. Um, how would you suggest to bring awareness to the importance of diversity and inclusion within the workplace, within an organization where upper management and executives are primarily not people of color?
Yeah, it's interesting because even in some of it, great question. What I was talking about earlier is that, oftentimes our leadership, who are not very diverse in many ways, will say diversity matters, but yet we're not seeing that, right? And I really think that we can no longer have all this rhetoric, but it's gonna take action. And one book outside of my own that I would encourage you to get your leadership is called Diversity Inc. By Pamela Newkirk. Diversity Inc. by Pamela Newkirk. And it talks about the history of diversity in companies. Like diversity, equity, inclusion isn't just a new thing. It's all over 40 years old. And some of the conversations that they were having in the 70s about diversity, we're still having them now, and there haven't been a lot of movement. And so we have to do things differently, right? The same things that we've been doing are not going to work if we want to be courageous leaders. And so what I would do, everything that I talk about, think about the strategy, have a book club, ask your leaders to, gift them this book and have them read it, and then have like a group wide discussion on it and see what themes come out of it. And so sometimes the way that we tell a story or that we get buy-in, we have to do it a little bit different, right? Because right now people are experiencing diversity fatigue, right? They don't want to hear about it anymore. They won't want to talk about it anymore. So we have to try to serve it in a different way. And I would say Diversity Inc. It really tells a really good story on where we have the opportunity. Right now, we have the opportunity, and there's so many possibilities for us to make the workplace better than we found it. And it's going to require some of those leaders to be courageous, right? And the last thing that I'll say is, oftentimes when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, a lot of people who are in power think that means that they won't have power anymore. But what would it look like if we expand the power, right? Everyone doesn't have to hold it, but if we share that, right? So it doesn't mean that Bob and Jim no longer get to call the shots, but what would it look like if we added a few more people to the people who are making decisions for the better good? And so I think that it can be seeing diversity as a whole. We need Bob and Jim too, but we need other people, right? And so this isn't pushing white men or women out of the way. It's all I often say success is not a solo sport. In order for us to be successful in the workplace, it's going to require different people making decisions for everybody.
Right. And that we hold, and you're right, that it's not taking away from other people, but holding space and holding room for that diversity and inclusion and for other people to grow.
Absolutely.
Okay. Nita asks, can you give another example of what it looks like for a leader to invest in someone else's potential for success? You probably have several of those.
A lot. But what I will say is one of the things that I teach at my class at NYU is we talk about leadership and management and how much of your workforce do you want, right? To get out of. And so what I mean by that is if you're only investing, let's say you have a team of 10, if you're only investing in 4 of your 10 employees, then there's 6 that you're not getting their best from, right? You're not invested in their success. And when you invest in everyone's success, then that creates better productivity. And when you have an employee who enjoys being part of the team, then that's better for business, right? And so management engagement is crucial for everyone on the team. And I would encourage all managers, even right now, if you're not, having one-on-ones and asking, and this is where the courageous listening comes, because sometimes we don't want to ask the questions to get answers that we know we might not want to hear, right? But these are the things that'll make us better. But surveying, asking the questions of your team, what does good look like? What do you need from me to be successful? And articulating that as you're part of my team, our team, I want you to be able to do the best work of your life here while we're working together. What do you need from me to provide you? What tools do you need to be successful? And I don't think that we're asking everybody for that. And so the next time, if you've only been giving those 3 to 4 people opportunities, think about what it looks like to give the other 6 opportunities, right? Spread that equity. Again, I think too many managers focus on quote unquote their rock stars, but that's because they've only gotten to know those quote unquote rock stars, right? And so we could produce a team that everybody is a rock star once we understand what our team's strengths are and where there's room for growth, we can invest in them in a way that really produces a rock star team.
Absolutely. Okay, a few more questions for you. What advice do you have for managers who are struggling to lean into their courage?
Yes, and it's tough. Listen, I have to tell you, I love Beyonce, and she has a song, and she says, "I woke up like this." I did not wake up like this. It took a lot of time.
I think a few of us wake up like Beyonce, but
No, I wish. I'm trying to figure it out. If you know what pill I need to take, then I will definitely do it. But for me, it was those small acts of courage, right? And so I constantly, even to this day, I ask myself, if I'm not courageous today, who misses out? Because courage is a chain reaction, right? And so if you're a manager thinking about that, if you don't be courageous for everyone on your team, then who leaves the team not getting, not leveraging their full potential, right? And you hired that person to give their full potential. And so as a manager, we're doing our team a disservice if we aren't courageous, right? If right now racial unrest is top of mind for everybody, or the election, right? Regardless of who you're voting for, this is a tough time, right? People are feeling anxiety, and part of providing your team with success is finding out, what do you all need in the next 2 weeks, right? What type of resources are going to help you do your job? Because I know that there's a lot going on in this world, right? That's being courageous. Where we've always been taught, don't talk about race, don't talk about religion, don't talk about politics at work. And it's not those things that cause the angst, it's how we talk about them, right? And so think about your servant leadership to your team in this way, and then also lean into that courage. And it only takes a little bit, because courage is contagious.
Oh, you were right about that. I've seen many times the second where one person takes a stand, someone else, it inspires someone else courage, and it just kind of has a domino effect of creating positivity in an environment and creating courageous leadership. So another question, when's the last time you had to be courageous?
You're asking the hard questions. I think every day that I have the opportunity and the privilege to be able to speak about courage, right? And sometimes being courageous is not being popular, right? But we know
Right.
that there were so many leaders that came before us, and we're beneficiaries of their courage. I'm beneficiaries of a lot of men and women that came before us. And if it wasn't for their courage, I probably wouldn't be having this conversation with Leslie right now. And so I think about that too. What am I leaving the next generation? How will they be a beneficiary of my courage, right? And so that's how I think about it. And so every day I consider the work that I do a revolution, an active revolution, to be able to talk about the topics that often have not been top of mind for many people. And I think that's so important. And so even on the days when I'm nervous about talking about race and women of color in the workplace, I lean into that courage, because I know, again, nobody benefits from it. And it's writing books like the memo, and I'm working on 2 other books that will push the envelope a little bit more. And I think that that's what we have to do to make the workplace better than we found it.
Oh, well, fantastic. And of course you're working on 2 more books, not just 1, but 2, because you're just amazing and an inspiration, and you work hard, and you use your own courage to lead for everyone else, and you're paving the way and holding the space for so many women and so many people in need of your skills. So I thank you. So I think we're almost out of time. Is there anything else you want to add to the conversation before we close out?
I just want to thank you for making my job easy. You've been great. Give Leslie some love in the chat. And I just want to thank Dr. White and everybody behind the scenes. It's been great. And I hope you will think about who you can be courageous for.
Well, thank you so much. I've learned a ton from you, and I know everyone tuned in today has learned a ton from you as well. So on behalf of the Greenville Chamber's 4th Annual DEI Summit and presenting sponsor Michelin, North Carolina, I want to officially thank Minda Harts and everyone watching for your participation in this event. At this time, you may log out and transition to the next segment of today's summit as per your agenda. I think we actually have lunch next, and I think we pick back up at 1/3 D, I believe. But all that information is on the Summit's website. So this concludes our session. Thank you guys all so much. We'll see you later on today.